Hello class, welcome to week 3, day 3, expectations as well as the close reading. Hope you guys are doing well. Please comment below how you guys are doing. If you have any questions, please email me or you can even just comment below. But let's dive into the expectations first and then the close reading. So very first thing is I want you guys to do the close reading, which begins on page 39, finishes on page 47. After that, I want you to choose an explorer from the list to research more about. That is this list right here. We're looking at James Cook, Amerigo Vespucci, Francisco Pizarro, Hernando Cortez, Nunez de Balboa. Just a page of notes, a page of information explaining who either of these people are, and as well as their routes. Draw a map of the routes that they took. So that's one of your tasks that you're doing today, close reading, looking up more information about one of those explorers. In addition, I want you to complete any math homework from Miss Moore, review and practice movements from mystery class, as well as make sure that you're just moving in general today, either with light cardio such as walking, running, or really anything else. I really hope you guys are doing this. I can't emphasize it enough. I'm going to say it in every single video. But yeah, those are the expectations for today. Close reading, research on one of those explorers, math homework, mystery, and movement. Alright, let's dive into the close reading that begins on page 39. Alright. As you remember from 5th grade, Prince Henry the Navigator, a member of the Portuguese royal family, was one of the earliest rulers to become interested in exploration. In 1400s, he made it his life's mission to find a way to use ships to take part in the African slave trade, which the Muslims were controlling, and to trade with Asia. He set up a school of navigation and map making. He gathered together sea captains and shipbuilders to build the best ships. Then in 1433, he sent many of his most knowledgeable experts out to sea to explore the African coast. The only one that made it as far as the other side of the Cape Bojador, which was the name of the large bump coming out of the western part of Africa. It was farther south than any other European had gone before, as it was believed to be that of the Sea of Darkness that lay beyond, and that the equator was so hot one would burn up. The Portuguese continued to explore Africa even after Prince Henry's death, and in 1488, Bartholomew Dias sailed around the Cape of Good Hope on the southern tip of the African continent. The Portuguese eventually colonized the Cape of Good Hope, and only recently have the native people in South Africa gained their independence back from white rule. The Portuguese took advantage of their access to West African coast to set up sugarcane plantations using African slave labor to work them. Slave trading was begun on a large scale by the Portuguese at this time, using human life as barter with other nations. The Portuguese also traded in gold and ivory from Africa. Vasco da Gama was a Portuguese who was determined to continue Prince Henry's mission to find a way to India and Asia by sea. In 1498, he rounded the Cape of Good Hope and sailed eastward to India, landing in Calicut, now Calcutta, a large trading port on the western coast of India. The Arabs, who already did lots of trading with Indians, knew how to give gifts to the Hindu ruler, called the Zamorin, in order to gain favor and receive permission to trade. But Da Gama and his men were not so well prepared. They very much wanted to return home with a cargo of spices and jewels, but the Zamorin, possibly offended, would only sell them food. Nevertheless, Da Gama was considered a hero by his nation upon his return to Portugal. For now, the Portuguese would no longer have to rely on his high prices set by Arab traders, or the slower overland trading roads with the high tolls. Da Gama felt that the only way Portugal could have access to trade in the east was to use force. First, the Portuguese sent ships and cannons and conquered the port of Cochin, south on the coast of Calicut, and built a trading post there. Da Gama himself went back to Calicut in about 1504 to bombard the city and get the Zamorin to agree to let the trading post in Cochin be left alone. Similar force was used to capture Malaysia and the Moluccas, or the Spice Islands. The Portuguese came to dominate much of India and Ceylon, and traded with China and Japan as well. The Dutch and English later took over trade in India and Asia due to Portugal's weakening as a nation in the 1600s. The East India Dutch Company, a huge company owned by many wealthy Europeans, including royalty, was established to trade goods from the Spice Islands. The Dutch tended to be more successful as traders than the Portuguese had been, particularly in China and Japan. This is because they were not interested in converting other people to Christianity, but focused on business only. Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand the monarchs of Spain, also became interested in searching for new trade routes. It was Isabella who had the sense of adventure and Ferdinand who would find a way to finance the voyages Spain began in the late 1400s. Isabella and Ferdinand was a powerful couple, known for how they had united Spain and ruled it as equals. Devout Catholics, they also had little tolerance for other beliefs and had little moral trouble with the notion of conquering and dominating people in other lands for financial gain. As you learned in 5th grade, they were the ones who sent Christopher Columbus off to find the New World. As soon as Columbus came back from the first voyage to the New World, the Spanish and Portuguese realized that there could be a lot of potential problems between them if they were to be exploring in the same seas and claiming for themselves the land and gold they each found. They agreed to let Pope Alexander VI settle their disputes. Their agreements was called the Treaty of Tordesillas. In 1493, a year after Columbus landed in the West Indies and 5 years before Da Gama landed in India, a great global division was made from the North Pole to the South Pole, down through the Ocean Sea. Anything to the east of the line was Portugal's, and anything to the west was Spain's. Obviously, we know with a round world, their land claims would eventually end up overlapping. But for the time, the treaty worked well. Of course, the people who actually lived in all these places didn't necessarily agree. Pedro Alvarez Cabral was a Portuguese sea captain who in 1500 was sailing for India following Da Gama's route along the African coast. However, he ran into bad winds and was completely thrown off course. He ended up in the coast of what we now know to be Brazil and claimed it for Portugal. Ironically, although it was in the Western Hemisphere, it was also still east of the line fixed by the Treaty of Tordesillas, and so the claim was honored for Portugal. Amerigo Vespucci was an Italian navigator who sailed on several voyages with the Portuguese across the Ocean Sea, which is what the Atlantic Ocean was known as then. It was during these trips that Vespucci became convinced that this was a new world and not islands off the coast of India. Vespucci was on a voyage which was expected to round the Cape of Catagari, just south of the equator, and sail on to India. It was during these voyages to South America that European explorers saw the constellation of the Southern Cross for the first time, losing sight of the North Star over the northern horizon. Vespucci and his party were using maps that the ancient Greek Ptolemy had made long ago, but Vespucci, while in the process of determining their longitude, suddenly realized that these stars were not the ones that should be overhead at such a point. This confirmed his suspicion that this was a whole new continent. Vespucci went back to the Portuguese king with the maps of the South American coastline and reported that he believed that there must be another ocean on the other side of this new world, which would lead to Asia and India. The name America comes from Vespucci's name, Amerigo. The Spanish thirst for gold led to the invasion of the Aztec Empire in Mexico. Although the Aztecs were often willing to give gifts in trade for gold, the Spanish wanted more than this. Hernando Cortez led the capture and destruction of the wealthy and huge city of Tenochtitlan, well inland from the Gulf of Mexico. Horses and guns, never before seen by the Aztecs, played a large role in the conquest. Cortez also cut off the aqueducts that brought water to the city. The Aztecs fought for 4 months but finally were defeated. The Spanish eventually built Mexico City on this site. The Spanish used a town on the Pacific coast of Central America as a base for exploring the southern part of the continent. Vasco Núñez del Balboa was a Spanish explorer who crossed Panama and discovered what he called the South Sea. We now know it to be the Pacific Ocean. Another explorer, Francisco Pizarro, was a soldier who wanted to find fame and fortune as Cortez had. He had heard of a place called Peru, and that was said to be a land of gold. First, he explored south by ship on the Pacific side of Central America until he came to a city called Tumbes, which was part of the Incan Empire. There, he saw walls sheeted with gold and met friendly people. He returned to Spain for ships, guns, horses, and men, and returned to Peru to conquer it for Spain. The Incan emperor soon realized that the Spanish wanted gold and offered them a room full of it in exchange for being left alone. The Spanish agreed, but soon decided that this was not enough, and Pizarro overthrew the Incas completely. Soon after this, Pizarro was killed by a rival group of conquistadors who had taken to fighting amongst themselves for rule over the new lands and riches. The Spanish not only wanted gold, they wanted to conquer and rule. They set up colonial governments everywhere they went. And the governors of these colonies swore allegiance to the Spanish throne. The biggest business of the colonies was to reap the wealth of the lands. Indians, as the native populations were called, were forced to build cities and work the gold, silver, and gem mines. The mining of the gold became so important that they carefully constructed irrigation systems which kept the land green and fruitful were neglected. Christian missionaries traveled to South America to preach the Catholic faith. They often forced the Indians to wear Western-style clothing, and they destroyed temples, statues, and other Incan religious sites and artifacts. One bishop in the Yucatan ordered the mass burning of the beautifully painted Mayan books, which were the only evidence of a written Native American language. The Indians decided that the white Europeans must be gods to be so powerful, and often converted to Christianity willingly. In addition to their religion, the Spanish also brought diseases with them, such as smallpox and syphilis. Between disease and the slave-like conditions, the nation population of Mexico was decimated to about a 20th of what had been before the arrival of Cortez. The Portuguese and Spanish continued to practice the using of the slave trade to establish their wealth in the Americas. Slaves were used to work on sugarcane, tobacco, and tropical fruit plantations in South America. However, the Portuguese gradually realized that they could also get rich by providing other nations with slave labor to spread their own colonization efforts. Later, the Portuguese lost their grip as a world power when they were taken over by Spain in 1580. Then the English and French became heavily involved in the slave trade. They set up what would become known as a triangular trade. The first stage of this was when merchants in Europe would ship goods and weapons to Africa in exchange for African natives to be used as slaves. Slavery had been practiced in Africa from the earliest times, and it was often the African rulers themselves who traded goods for people who had been captured from other tribes. However, the way Africans practiced slavery amongst themselves was very different from the way Europeans used it. Children born of slave women were considered free, and usually an adult slave had an opportunity to buy back their freedom. Slaves in African society often had a role and place in society, as practiced by the colonists. Slaves were considered property. It was often thought to be a good business to work slaves even to death. Chances are many of the African rulers did not know at first what they were subjecting their people to. Later, the slave trade had a disastrous effect on African societies. Tribes sometimes used the arms they had acquired through trading with the Europeans to do battle with other tribes, hoping to gain captives to trade away as slaves. The Middle Passage, or second part of the triangular trade, was the worst of all, in which Africans were chained in extreme confinement with little food or water or air in the bottom of ships and taken to the Americas. Many died before reaching the shore. Those who survived were sold in open marketplaces and often subjected to brutal working conditions. The third leg of the triangle was when products from American plantations were shipped to Europe and used to generate money to purchase more slaves from Africa, and so the cycle began again. The Spanish ships full of gold, making their way routinely back across the Atlantic to Spain, were vulnerable to hurricanes that raged through the Caribbean. There was another threat as well, from the many pirates who roamed just outside the West Indies and near the European coast. The area around the Caribbean Sea became known as the Spanish Main. Pirate crews were often made up of men of many nationalities, African, European, and Indian, who were willing to attack any merchant ship. Some pirates also became slavers, capturing slave ships as they left the African shore, or raiding African slave ports. Runaway slaves sometimes took to pirating as well. Another kind of pirate, called a privateer, was someone who was given license by their king or queen to attack ships for the gain of the country. Elizabeth I of England, with the help of Sir Walter Raleigh, used privateering to gain wealth for England. The French privateers, or corsairs, in turn attacked English ships coming through the English Channel on their way to London. Often there were strict rules about privateering, where one could only attack ships belonging to the countries that one's own country was at war with, and where those who were captured were treated well and allowed to go free. Later, under James I, such privateering licenses in England were withdrawn, and completely lawless buccaneers took over the privateering businesses in the Spanish Main. The buccaneers were often murderous and cruel. As you may remember from the studies in 5th grade, the English, Dutch, and French were the people who made the most inroads in North America. Although the Spanish claimed much of the southwestern part of North America for themselves, they soon realized that they were not likely to find much gold there. Alright, that is a close reading. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you missed any parts, go ahead and replay the video or just reread it yourselves. And then work on these tasks of researching these people. Great. Thank you, and goodbye.